Our thoughts this evening are entitled From the Tabernacle to the Temple. And brethren, as we're all aware, there are different approaches to profitable Bible study. For example, when we look at the tabernacle, there are many paths that we can take. We may zoom in very closely and look at the construction details, such as the choice of materials, the manner of construction, and measurements of the structure. Or we may take the eye-level approach of looking at the tabernacle in operation. And we may focus on a particular sacrifice. And so we will scrutinize the type of sacrifice, how it was prepared, and what was done with the blood, the meat, and the hide, and its antitypical significance. Today, I would like to take a different approach, what we might term the 40,000-foot level, and we'd like to zoom out and do a survey over a long time frame of the events associated with the tabernacle until it was incorporated into the temple. By doing this, we want to trace God's operation with Israel. And as we do this, we want to note some of the lessons along the way that God intended for natural Israel. We want to ask ourselves, why did God operate in the way that he did? What was Israel expecting? And what actually did happen, and why? We'd like to begin tracing God's dealings with Israel in the book of Exodus. There we find God gave Moses on Mount Sinai explicit, detailed instructions of the construction of the tabernacle and its furnishings. And here we come to the first principle of operation. There is a proper place to worship, a proper place to worship. The tabernacle was to be the center of worship for Israel. In fact, it was the only place for worship. And the reason for this is that the tent of meeting was the only place that was holy enough to house God's presence. So we read in Exodus 25, verses 21 and 22. And you shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I shall give you. There I will meet with you, and from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim that are on the ark of the testimony, I will speak with you about all that I will give you in commandment for the people of Israel. Well, this was fulfilled when the tabernacle was erected and dedicated to the Lord. The cloud that covered Israel by day and housed the fiery pillar that was seen at night descended on the tabernacle itself. Within the cloud and fiery pillar, God's presence or glory came down into the tabernacle. And while it filled the tabernacle, Moses was unable to enter. This physical manifestation of God's presence was also seen when the priests offered their first sacrifices a day following their consecration. The glory of the Lord was revealed to the people, and fire from the cloud over the tabernacle came down and consumed the sacrifice that was on the altar. While all Israel had clearly seen the glory and presence of the Lord filling the tabernacle, thereafter it seems to have been physically manifested not in the tabernacle itself, but in the cloud and fiery pillar that remained above the tabernacle for the remainder of the 40 years in the wilderness. Some brethren envision an additional manifestation of God's presence in the tabernacle itself as a light between the cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant. That is called the Shekinah Glory. And this word is not found in the scriptures, but the idea is based on scriptural reasoning by rabbinic scholars. It is interesting to note, however, that the only time God's presence is described in connection with the Ark of the Covenant, there is no light mentioned only a voice. This is in another account of the dedication of the tabernacle found not in Exodus, but in Numbers. And I'd like to read Numbers 7:89. And when Moses went into the tent of meeting to speak with the Lord, he heard the voice speaking to him from above the mercy seat that was on the ark of the testimony from between the two cherubim, and it spoke to him. Here then is the proper place to worship. It is the place where God is and where God speaks. The second principle of God's operation was there is a proper way to worship. And as we know, everything had to be done according to explicit directions which were communicated to Moses. Listen to this strict commandment regarding the smallest of details. And you shall say to the people of Israel, this shall be my holy anointing oil throughout your generations. It shall not be poured on the body of an ordinary person, and you shall make no other like it in composition. It is holy, and it shall be holy to you. Whoever compounds any like it, or whoever puts any of it on an outsider, shall be cut off from his people. Whoever makes any like it to use as perfume shall be cut off from his people. When an Israelite wanted to have an interaction with their God, they had to learn that it had to be in the way that God specified. There was no room for cutting corners. There was no room for compromise. No room for substituting their idea of how it should be done. And following the dedication of the tabernacle and the priesthood, this lesson was reinforced by God himself. Nadab and Abihu, sons of Aaron, offered strange fire, and they were immediately struck dead in the tabernacle precincts. They had approached God incorrectly. Aaron and Miriam rebelled against Moses' leadership position, and immediately they were rebuked by God, and Miriam was struck with leprosy. They were substituting their own ideas of who God should communicate through. A man picks up sticks on the Sabbath, and Moses had him stoned to death. The lesson? There was no room for cutting corners. Korah instigated a rebellion against Aaron's lineage of priests, and immediately he and his followers were swallowed up by the earth. Again, they were substituting their own ideas of who God should communicate through. So these things were done in the sight of the whole camp of Israel. So by the end of the wilderness wanderings, everyone who had not espoused this principle of operation, that their God could only be worshiped in the proper way, was dead. Conversely, when these two principles of operation were met, we can trace the unmistakable presence of God among the Israelites. We see that it was the movement of the Ark of the Covenant which caused the Jordan to recede and the people crossed over into the Promised Land. Again, the Ark was paraded around Jericho by the priests, and it was clearly seen that it was the Ark embodying God's presence which was the power behind the destruction of Jericho and all of Israel's enemies. That this awesome power was known to the people in the vicinity was evidenced by Rahab, which she related to the two spies in Joshua 2. God was with his people, and as a result, Israel's enemies were melting away in front of them. Israel entered and conquered the Promised Land, at which point Joshua established the tabernacle in a permanent place in Shiloh. Now, in light of God's operations thus far, what would have been the expectation of an Israelite after having entered the land? I think it would have been that things would continue as they were. Israelite life would center around the tabernacle in Shiloh, and God's presence would be miraculously displayed. But that isn't what happened. For the next 400 years or so, the tabernacle isn't even mentioned. It plays no role in Israel's history as given in the book of Judges. And yet the opportunity was there. Deborah and Barak don't take the ark before them into battle. Gideon doesn't consult the Urim and the Thummim to make decisions. Gideon offers sacrifices, but not at the tabernacle. And there are no consequences. No fire comes down from heaven. The earth doesn't swallow anyone up. And the judges are victorious in battle without the ark. So naturally we ask ourselves, what are we to think of this? Why do we have this sudden departure from God's previous method of dealing with his people? Well, first of all, we have to acknowledge that the method was producing its desired results. The younger generation that came out of the wilderness wanderings had learned the lesson that there was a proper place to worship and a proper way to worship, and had taken them to heart. We are told that that generation under Joshua that had seen the commandments given and punishments meted out and the miraculous power of God properly worshiped God all of their days. So why the change? Well, as I see it, God wanted to produce different results. The two principles that God could only be worshiped in the proper way and in the proper place remain. But thus far, Israel had only reached the foundation level of these principles. Properly worshiping at the tabernacle was not the end game. Now God wanted to bring his people up to a higher level of understanding of these principles. So God changed his method and began a long and a slow process to introduce new concepts. Let's pause at this point and ask, what was the end game? What trajectory was Israel on? Jesus gives us the answer in John 4:21 to 24. Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. The hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. Here then is the end game of worship. The proper place to worship is in the spiritual temple, which is Jesus's body. The only way to approach the Father is in and through belief of Jesus's atoning sacrifice. And the proper way to worship is not in the old human way, but in a spirit way that is revealed by the giver of truth. God's people had to go from worshiping at a tabernacle that they could see to worshiping at a condition of belief that they could not see. The proper place to worship was not a place at all. It is a thought in your mind. It is belief and faith in Jesus. And it is remarkable to think that during a very short 3.5 years, some may have been privileged enough to have caught a glimpse of Jesus during his ministry. But for everyone else, this belief is based not even on what we have seen, but what others have seen and have testified to. And God's people had to go from worshiping in human ways to worshiping in a spirit way, when it's impossible for humans to understand the way of a spirit. Our best approximation of worshiping in spirit is to strive for the spirit of the law and not the letter of the law. Our best approximation of worshiping in spirit is to understand that while we can give all that we have, even our body to be burned, if it isn't motivated by love, it is nothing in God's eyes. Our best approximation of worshiping in spirit is to let the unseen power of the Holy Spirit transform us into something that can be born on the spirit plane. But at the end of the book of Joshua, Israel is a long way off from these abstract ideas of true worship. They are still at the foundation level. In human terms, they have learned a concrete place to worship and a concrete way to worship. They have been kept on this foundation level by God's enforcement of these principles. So now, during the time of the judges, God removes his enforcing hand. He will contrast Israelite life in Exodus with Israelite life under the judges. One has the true place and way to worship, and the other does not. The lessons learned over the next 400 years or so are twofold. First, if worship of God has to be enforced by punishments, it is not true worship. The generation that saw the miracles was not able to pass on the principles to the next generations. Perhaps the younger ones told the elders, "You might have seen the cloud over the tabernacle. It isn't there now. How do I know that God's presence is still with us?" And so in the book of Judges, we notice an ever worsening condition of what constituted worshiping Jehovah as a covenanted people. The second lesson learned was that without the unifying influence of the tabernacle, which is where the terms of the covenant were primarily met, Israel did not identify as one people. And so in the book of Judges, we notice an ever worsening relationship between the 12 tribes, to the point at the end of the book, they are destroying each other. The contrast between the ideal worship and the absence of true worship had been made. At this juncture, Israel was ready for the next step. They were ready to begin the path that would eventually lead them to Jesus. First, God wanted them to choose holiness on their own. And so 1 Samuel opens with the spotlight on the tabernacle at Shiloh. Eli, the high priest, serves in the tabernacle alongside his sons, who are under priests. Normally, when an animal is sacrificed, the best cuts are offered on the altar to Jehovah. The rest of the meat is boiled, and the priest gets to stick in a 3-pronged fork. And whatever meat is on the fork is the priest's portion to eat. The rest of the boiled meat is eaten by the family who brought the sacrifice. But the sons of Eli wanted the choice cuts for themselves, and they used force to get it. They were actually stealing meat from off the altar of the Lord. Can you imagine this scenario occurring during the Exodus? But now God allowed it to school the people. Contrasted with these corrupt priests is the child Samuel. His mother dedicated him to the service of Jehovah, even though he was of the tribe of Ephraim. From birth, he had been under a Nazirite vow of holiness. He was adopted by Eli into the tribe of Levi and served in the tabernacle. One night, Samuel was sleeping in the most holy, and Eli was sleeping in the holy. God spoke to Samuel from that sacred place. He told Samuel of his intention to remove the priesthood from Eli and of his intention to destroy Eli's lineage because they had not worshiped God in the proper way. All of Israel heard that God had spoken to Samuel and not to Eli. They knew it was because in God's eyes, Samuel was the Holy One and Eli was not. God continued to speak through Samuel at the tabernacle, and the people began to listen and take Samuel's words to heart, because they were now desiring a true priesthood like they had in the Exodus. Years passed, and the Philistines and Israelites went to war. The elders sent to Shiloh for the ark. They planned to have the ark go before them in battle, ensuring victory, as it did in the days of Joshua. When the Philistines heard of this, it struck fear in their hearts because they expected the Israelites to win, as they did in the days of Joshua. But that isn't what happened. The Philistines won the battle. The Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant. The Philistines killed the sons of Eli. And when the news of the battle reached Eli, he fell backwards and died when he heard that the ark was captured. His daughter-in-law went into labor and died, and with her last breath, she named the child Ichabod, meaning the glory of the Lord has departed. We learn from the book of Jeremiah and the Psalms that the Philistines then came to Shiloh and destroyed the tabernacle. We can readily feel the shock that reverberated through Israel at this turn of events. It must have been obvious that if God was not worshiped in the proper way, then he would remove his presence from Israel even during the most crucial times. It also must have been obvious that the wood, the gold, and fabric of the tabernacle was not in and of itself holy. Rather, these items, when properly used in worship, became holy because of God's presence. Returning to the narrative, the Philistines kept the Ark of the Covenant as a war trophy. First of all, they put it in the temple of their god Dagon. The next morning, they found the idol of Dagon faced forward on the ground. They stood him up. The next morning, the idol had again fallen down, and this time, the hands and the head of the idol were broken off and laying by the doorway. Wherever the ark went in Philistine territory, trouble followed. The inhabitants were plagued with some physical ailment. What exactly that was, it's hard to determine, but many died. Plagues of mice descended on them. By the end of 7 months, the Philistines determined to see if all this was being caused by their possession of the ark. So they took 2 milk cows and locked their calves up. They harnessed the cows to a cart carrying the ark, along with offerings of gold. If the cows pulled the cart to the land of Israel, they would know that the ark was the cause of their troubles. And this was a true test, because no cow would leave her calf, which was still nursing. And it was a miracle. The cows, looking neither to the right nor to the left, went straight to Israel. The men of Beth-Shemesh were harvesting when they saw the Ark of the Covenant coming, and they rejoiced to see it. They sacrificed the cows to Jehovah. Levites came and took the ark off of the cart. All seemed well. But then 70 men of Beth-Shemesh died. We aren't exactly sure why, but they had not received or treated the ark properly. In distress, they sent for men of another town to take the ark into their keeping. And the ark ended up in the house of Abinadab, who we assume was a priest, as his son Eleazar was consecrated to look after the ark. The ark remained in Abinadab's home, and during that time, Israel, bereft of a tabernacle they had often neglected, keenly felt its loss. It spurred them on to a reformation of heart. Under the direction of Samuel, they put away foreign gods. They were now beginning to choose the tabernacle arrangement of their own accord. The next time we encountered the tabernacle, many years had passed. Samuel was old, and Saul was king of Israel. David had defeated Goliath, had been anointed in secret by Samuel, and had been part of Saul's court, but now was a fugitive. Interestingly, the condition of the tabernacle is somewhat of a mystery. After the tabernacle at Shiloh was destroyed, we know that the ark continued in Kiriath Jearim at the house of Abinadab. But we read in 1 Samuel 21 that David went to Nob to visit the high priest. The priest was Ahimelech, who was the great-grandson of Eli. It seems as if part of the tabernacle had been rescued from the Philistine attack and assembled at Nob. The only elements we read of are the table of showbread and the priestly garment of the ephod containing the Urim and the Thummim. How this partial tabernacle functioned at this point is unknown. It is obvious, though, that the tabernacle was not fully restored after Shiloh because the ark was somewhere else. When David left King Saul's court and was running for his life, the first thing he did was go to the partial tabernacle at Nob. Ahimelech, the high priest, was very afraid to go against the wishes of King Saul. He would not help a fugitive. So David lied and said that he was on a secret mission from Saul. And so Ahimelech allowed him and his men to eat the leftover showbread that would have been for the priests. He also gave David Goliath's sword, which had been stored there wrapped in the ephod. But also at the tabernacle that day was a man named Doeg. Doeg was not an Israelite, but an Edomite. He was also in Saul's employ. He went and told Saul that Ahimelech, the priest, helped David. In Saul's condition of mental instability and jealousy of David, he ordered his men to kill the high priests and the underpriests. The Israelites refused. So Saul ordered Doeg to kill 85 of them, which he did. Of all the low points in Israel's history, this has to be one of the lowest. What lessons were gained from this tragic event? It seems clear that something was amiss in allowing the tabernacle to remain separate. Why was there no impetus on behalf of Samuel or the various priests or even King Saul to restore the tabernacle? While it is impossible to fully know the reasons, we can trace some possible issues that impeded its restoration. We know that there were different lineages of Aaronic priests. In fact, during David's reign, he will have 2 high priests at the same time from different families. It is natural to assume that there would be power struggles between the various families. Perhaps the reason the tabernacle elements were not consolidated was that neither the family of Abinadab with the ark nor the family of Ahimelech with the table of showbread wanted to give up control over what they possessed. As Samuel had warned, once you elected a king, political power would center around him. The closer you were to the king, the more favor and more power your family possessed. That is why Ahimelech's fear of displeasing King Saul was more about retaining his family's influence than it was about serving God. And that is why God determined to remove Eli's lineage from the priesthood. Ahimelech, the great-grandson of Eli, and the 85 priests and Levites of his family were under this pronouncement. The family was not worthy of this office because they feared man more than they feared God. True worship of God means that you will want to please God more than anything else or anyone else. This concept is the first step in learning to worship God, not in human terms, but in spirit. God also used this event to illustrate that his favor had left King Saul, and that his favor was now with David. Saul not only had the 85 priests killed, but he destroyed everyone and everything that lived in Nob. The only one who escaped was the son of Ahimelech. His name was Abiathar. He went to join David in exile, and he brought with him the ephod, which contained the Urim and the Thummim. And David proceeded to use the Urim and the Thummim in his battle plans and in order to escape Saul. The Lord, through the instrumentality of the Urim and Thummim, blessed David. King Saul by this time had lost the favor of the Lord. He was unable to find a priest or prophet that could allow him to speak with God. So all of Israel could see who God's presence was really with. And the people began to back David because they were choosing the place or person where God's presence was. In the process of bringing the nation of Israel up to a higher level of understanding as to what constitutes the place of true worship, God was blurring the lines between the concrete and the abstract. Originally, the true place of worship was at the intact and consecrated tabernacle. But with the tabernacle in disarray, the Lord used the separate elements of the tabernacle to demonstrate his presence. But this is with the important distinction that one must first recognize the sanctity of the objects because they belong to the tabernacle. It wasn't the object in and of itself, but the objects retain their association with God's presence revealed in the tabernacle. The family of Ahimelech used the elements of the tabernacle to further their own fleshly desires and family influence. And so their association with the tabernacle spelled their destruction. David, on the other hand, had approached the tabernacle of God as God's dwelling, where, as one favored by the Lord, he would find succor. And thereafter, an ephod alone was used to propel David to the throne of Israel. And once David had attained to the throne of the entire nation of Israel, his thoughts turned to the tabernacle. King David possessed the impetus to restore the tabernacle. He began by bringing the Ark of the Covenant to the city of David. As had been done before, the ark was placed on a cart pulled by oxen. Many people were in attendance, including Levites and priests. There were musicians that led the procession, playing with all their might. All of this was being done with the right condition of heart. No doubt David believed that by entering fully into the spirit of worship, he was worshiping properly and pleasing God. No doubt David was hoping for some manifestation of God's presence and blessing. But that isn't what happened. Instead, one of the sons of Abinadab, named Uzzah, reached out to steady the ark when the oxen stumbled. God's anger broke forth and Uzzah was struck dead. The entire procession stopped. And David ordered the ark turned aside to the nearby house of Obed-Edom. David went back to the city and alternated between anger and fear. He asked, "How could the Lord have done this to me?" After 3 months, he concluded that the manner of conveying the ark was incorrect. First, the priests and the Levites had to consecrate themselves for the task. Then the Levites were to carry the ark on their shoulders with poles. Burnt offerings and peace offerings were incorporated into the procession. Again, there was music. And this time, the people, including David, danced in frenzied devotion at the head of the procession. And so the ark was successfully brought to the city of David and placed inside a tent. There it remained until it was transferred into Solomon's temple. We know we are on the right course at our 40,000 foot level because the very lesson we are looking for is given to us within this account. And the lesson is that God must be worshiped in the proper way. But with this unexpected turn of events, David was forced to stop and consider. And we also need to stop and consider at this juncture because there is a deeper lesson to be found. We know that David was a man after God's own heart, meaning that his heart, his intention was right. But was he doing all within his ability to align his actions with that motivation? Although he was choosing to worship God in the proper place by reassembling the tabernacle and bringing it to Jerusalem, he still had to choose to worship God in the proper way. It is instructive to note that he chose the proper method of bringing the ark to Jerusalem. It was not in fear of the punishment that befell Uzzah. Instead, he was motivated by a true heart desire to serve God in the proper way. And we know this because David's devotion did not diminish. Rather, it increased. The first time, David played musical instruments before the ark. The second time, David danced in frenzied devotion before the ark. And this dancing is remarked in the account as being out of the ordinary. It was an evidence that David had fully grasped the lesson God was teaching. And grasping the lessons of true worship is what the Jewish age was designed to do. The law was a pedagogue to bring the people to Jesus, in whom the true worship of Jehovah centers. Jesus himself replaces the literal temple, both for us in the gospel age and for the world of mankind, when there is no need for a temple. For the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the temple of it, as we read in Revelation 21 and verse 22. Brethren, we are so privileged at this end of the age to understand the end point of God's plan. When all, both in heaven and in earth, will be able to serve God acceptably from a true desire to serve him in the way he has designed, in spirit and in truth. It is our privilege to trace throughout the entire Old Testament just how God operated in his dealings with his people. I have gained many insights by viewing the tabernacle from this vantage point, and I hope these thoughts have been a blessing to you as well. May the Lord add his blessing.